It's time for PaleoRadio, only on Secular Media Network.
You are now entering PaleoRadio.
Welcome to PaleoRadio with your hosts Jeremiah Bannister and Joe Elder.
Hello, my friends. It has been way too long. I'm Jeremiah Bannister.
And I am Joe Elder.
And you are listening to PaleoRadio. Boy, oh freaking boy, we were gone, Joe, for a minute. A little bit kind of gone.
Yeah, a little bit. We went all around and upside down in every which way, didn't we?
Yeah, not completely AWOL. In fact, you hosted the first live episode of PaleoRadio since you and I have joined Superpowers.
Yeah, which was very fun. We had Ed Brayton on of Patheos. We also had Justin Schieber from Real Atheology on the show. You guys can check that out on Spreaker. We have it uploaded. It's episode 34. Pretty dope.
And I called in with my super schwanky hat on. Gregory,
yes,
I love you for that. I'll always use that word, schwanky. I love that. But I called in from Palm Springs. My dad had me out there to work. He covered all expenses. I was there for two reasons: to be a best man in his wedding. He's been with Celia, my new stepmom, for a number of years now, and they finally tied the knot. I'm super excited for them. But I was also there because he offered me the opportunity to work long hours with very little sleep. It was fun, but it was very challenging in order to save up money so that this summer Team Tiny Dancer can go and travel. And we've already raised enough so far to go to Pennsylvania, New York City, and Washington, D.C., even to go to Reason Rally. So we're excited about that. Whole bunch of news, but people can find that out on TeamTinyDancer.com.
Yeah, that is great. Congratulations to your dad. Congratulations to your new stepmom. It is a fantastic step. Speaking of fantastic, we have a great lineup of segments here for you guys.
We have four. We're going to start out with Climate Change is Already Disrupting 92,000 People's Lives by Kelly Dickerson over at science.mike.
And that's just the confirmed people that are talking about that. We also are going to be moving into talking about inside the GOP and their effort to draft an independent candidate against Donald Trump, and also his issues with Paul Ryan. That's going to be a fun little double article segment that we're going to get into.
And then we've got this one promising to be controversial. It's by Raheem Kassam over at Breitbart, and it's entitled, UN Director Admits Syrians Not Fleeing Over War, Gulf Countries, quote, haven't taken a single one.
Yeah, that is a great article, and I think it's going to get into some pretty interesting issues. That UN director is a pretty inspiring guy.
He seems to be pretty inspiring. Yeah, and he's not afraid. He's an audacious dude. He's saying some pretty intense things and riling people up, really ruffling some feathers.
And then we're going to finish off with former Facebook workers admitting that they routinely suppress conservative news. This is off of Gizmodo. Really interesting article talking about how they basically are monitoring the trending topics and kind of withholding or blacklisting some certain sites.
Really interesting. Every single one of these topics are just awesome. But we're going to start out here. Climate change is already disrupting 92,000 people's lives. It's by Kelly Dickerson over at science.mike. There's still a shocking number of people who don't believe man-made climate change is real. But there are 92,000 people who will tell you they've experienced its consequences firsthand. And you know, before we even get into it, Joe, it is shocking how many people don't believe that it's a man-made thing. Right? That climate change, like, I don't believe that, you know.
You know, we talk about how things always go in phases and arguments go in phases too. And the first phase is, you know, it's not happening or it can never happen. The second phase is it can happen, but we shouldn't do anything about it or we can't control it. The third phase is we can control it, but it's going to cost too much money. And the fourth phase is I told you we should have done it all along. And right now with climate change now, we're in step 2, which is, hey, we know that climate change is happening. You just got to prove to me that man is doing it. But that's at least conceding one thing. We know that it's happening. There is a good amount of people that are still being disingenuous, but that group's growing smaller. Now the conversation is moving into, can we convince people that it's man-induced climate change?
You know, when I first saw this, when you first shared it with me, and I thought 92,000 people, I thought that doesn't seem like a very large number.
No.
It seems like a small number, but it says this. An analysis recently published in the journal Nature Climate Change examined hundreds of previously published studies. Researchers combined observations from 92,000 people spread across 137 countries who rely on farming, hunting, and gathering for their survival and livelihood.
So 92,000 is just the sample size. That's the confirmed amount of people that are talking about the changes. That's not just necessarily who they're predicting is being moved out of those areas. So this is actually just their sample size. 92,000 people in 137 countries.
Yeah, and people need to really focus on that and try to understand what that means, because I can just imagine. I mean, I can hear the gears grinding right now and saying, well, 92,000 people is just hardly anybody. I mean, there's more people than that in Grand Rapids. And
that's a great point, though.
Right.
It's a great thing to bring up. One thing, too, that we all need to consider is the majority of the world does still work on hunting and gathering and fishing for livelihood and worrying about the daily weather. Here in America, that's not so much of our issue. It can be in the middle parts of the United States. But for the most part, we have a different way of going about our lives and economically gaining from our lives. So when we see these changes, we'd post a picture of it and go, oh, it's snowing in May, la-di-da, changes in weather. But those changes in weather affect people, especially indigenous cultures, in a terrible, terrible way.
who rely on farming, hunting, and gathering for their survival.
Absolutely.
Right? Not just for their livelihood, but for their survival. And it made me think, I could only imagine, some really fat person in a chair in a living room watching TV, and it says, with air conditioning in there, saying there's no such thing as climate change. They're just mounting down McDonald's. They don't have to plant anything for their food. And then they go into the next board there it shows it, and it says the person's inside of a car with air conditioning on, and the radio's blasting, no such thing as climate change. There's air conditioning everywhere. The person is hearing about denialism in this, and they can be going through a drive-through to get the food. They could be sitting down and getting it out of their microwave. It's not as evident to them, right? It's almost as if they're kind of in a cocoon, this very, very ill-informed cocoon that allows them to say, well, like the snowball thing. I got a snowball in my hand. This confirms it. Jim Inhofe it. And so I think that goes on all the time. But they found that 70% of the populations saw changes in temperature, rainfall, and weather patterns, all of which affect major elements of their livelihood.
This can be a very big deal because these human observations fall in line with the climate data that's been collecting with the scientific instruments that we've all been using according to the study. So this is basically kind of a confirmation on the ground floor. What you're getting is, this is what the data is showing, this is the trend that we're going in. If we go into these areas, we should be seeing massive changes, and indeed we are. One thing I just wanted to bring up is, it's interesting that people will talk about how we believe that man is the superior being on Earth and that man is responsible for controlling the Earth, or even not responsible, at least we have the competency to think about doing such a thing, right? And we can in the same breath say that we're that important or we're that instrumental to making everything work, but at the same time we can't accept that we could be the ones doing the climate change. To me, it's hypocritical. It's so much arrogance on one side to say that, yes, we indeed control all the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and the animals and the beasts of the land, right? But on the other hand, go, well, I mean, it couldn't possibly be human beings, almost 7 billion of us driving around in these cars.
Because God loves us so much, he wouldn't allow that to happen to us.
That's right.
He's got a different kind of plan for the end times. Just ask John Hagee. He knows all about it.
If you get into these arguments with someone who's an avid climate change denier and they happen to be religious, the very first question you need to ask them right off the bat before you get any further is, can human beings destroy the world on their own without advice or help of a deity? And if they say no, you can't even get close to a climate change argument there. The problem is that they think only God can destroy the earth.
And that's it. There's nothing man could do. There's nothing man could do that would change that.
It's fleeting.
Yep. Climate change is affecting individuals' ability to grow food and raise animals. Quote, secondary impacts of climate change on both wild and domesticated plants and animals are extensive and threaten the food security of subsistence-oriented communities. The effects seem to be worse in regions in the Pacific Islands, Central Africa, and North American Arctic. And I mentioned in the pre-show, I was talking to you in the lead-up to this, and I was thinking about these islands, and you knew right offhand, you knew right away which ones I was talking about.
The Solomon Islands have already, there's been 2 of them that have already sunk. This is probably a little bit premeditated, a little early, But they say in Louisiana that there's a city that they've already spent $42 million to move everybody out of the area because the city is no longer habitable. It's basically been overwashed with water. And they're saying that this could be the beginning of climate refugees in Louisiana because they're expecting a lot of people that live in kind of the boggy marsh areas to be experiencing this sooner than later.
The pictures of people in Venice are just crazy because you have people who are sitting down, sipping on macchiatos, and they've got water literally all the way up to their knees in these chairs. And it's wild.
When the tide comes in Venice, it's actually overflowing the streets at this point, yeah.
Right, and you know what? It's like the government's just not doing anything about it.
Why don't they just lift the city up? I mean, come on.
Oh, my goodness. So back to the article here. It's talking about how some people have had to change their behavior, like you were talking about just a moment ago here in the United States even, where people have had to change their behavior to adapt to an unpredictable climate. And here's a quote from the study. Fine-scale environmental changes have enormous consequences for local communities as they not only disrupt crop calendars, destroy harvests, and trigger soil erosion, but can increase conflict over limited resources and enhance risk to vulnerable members of society. So you look at it and you say, yeah, think about this for a second. We're seeing this in Michigan a little bit already with our weather changes here. I mean, look, man, we're in May. And it's 40 degrees and pretty cold. It seems like our winters are different a little bit. I mean, I've heard people exchanging conversations recently about what it was like, even when they were younger and stuff with snow at certain times of the year and how it seems like stuff is kind of shifting around. But you look at it and say where it's hit really hard, like the Pacific Islands, Central Africa, North American Arctic, to say it disrupts crop calendars. Just that statement in and of itself.
That's the biggest statement.
Yeah, you know this because of the way you were raised. You were raised on a farm.
And it's all about timing. For instance, if you're looking at a crop, corn, we have Memorial Day coming up here in about a week. During Memorial Day, when everybody's there paying their respects, you're going to see an awful lot of tractors and everything out if you're in a rural community. The reason why is corn gets planted by Memorial Day. They have a saying, knee-high by the 4th of July, which means your corn is growing nice and well if it's up to your knees by the 4th, obviously. And you're on your way, and then you're harvesting off into the later ends of August. And that is the cycle that people are expecting, and people are making financial decisions and plans upon. And it's the same exact thing that's going on with different people with different crops at different times across the world. But the same exact issue is arising where the time frame is changing, and financially you've invested in certain time frames to get things done. And when those times don't come or you have a late frost that kills your crop, I mean, that's curtains for some people.
Valentina Savo, lead author on the study, told the Vancouver Sun, quote, "We think about climate change as something that you graph or something that happens in the Arctic, but these are the experiences of real people seeing changes firsthand. It's not theoretical. When the timing changes about when to plant and harvest, where rainfall is now concentrated and intense, it's very disruptive."
Love Paleo Radio? Join the club. Support our work by visiting patreon.com/Paleo Radio today.
Back to Eagle and Dragon.
I'll tell you, there's some fantastic news, totally fabulous. Last Friday, the beautiful couple, Bobby C. and Miss Ashley from No Religion Required, got married. Woo! Yeah, actually tied the knot. They were planning on getting married in October, and they were going to have a whole real cool gig going there with a bunch of great people. And they're still going to have that, but it's not going to be for their wedding. It's going to be kind of a party celebrating it. But I wanted to let everybody know, if you go to their Spreaker page at Spreaker.com/NoReligionRequiredPod, if you go to that website, you'll find their most recent episode. I was one of the guests on there talking about Paleo Radio, talking about Team Tiny Dancer. It was tons of fun. In fact, it was so much fun that at the end, we decided to come back in. The music had already started playing. It was already going. In fact, it was right there at the end. And I think it was Chris Tanner and Chris Hanna from Cellar Door Skeptics were on. It was a great time. Go check it out. Spreaker.com/NoReligionRequiredPod.
Perfect. Yeah, there are a lot of good friends there. No Religion Required, very good friends. Bobby C., Miss Ashley, the Prophet Jeremiah, and also Cellar Door Skeptics. They're our boys from right here in good old GR. Okay, going to the next topic here, we have WashingtonPost.com. This is inside the GOP's effort to draft an independent candidate to derail Trump. This is by Philip Rucker and Robert Costa. A band of exasperated Republicans, including 2012 presidential nominee Mitt Romney, a handful of veteran consultants, and members of the conservative intelligentsia, are actively plotting to draft an independent presidential candidate who could keep Donald Trump from the White House. These GOP figures are commissioning private polling, lining up major funding sources, and courting potential contenders, according to interviews with more than a dozen Republicans involved in these discussions. The effort has been sporadic all spring, but has intensified significantly in the 10 days since Trump effectively locked up the Republican nomination.
Yeah.
Which has changed things quite a bit.
It's changed things quite a bit. And, good luck on a couple different levels. I mean, good luck getting on the ballot. I mean, that's the first thing. I mean, they're having troubles, and this is one of the things. The other one is really convincing somebody to get in on this. And I know we're going to touch on this. This is what this is about. But, I mean, that's a tough sell. You're trying to get somebody to buy a pretty crappy bit of real estate.
Well, you're basically trying to get him to be an assassination candidate.
Right.
You're saying, look, you're not going to win this thing, but we want you to affect the voting enough in a few of these swing states to make this a problem. That is literally what this is. Like, just so people understand, if someone runs as an independent right now, they're still not going to get their name on probably 20% of the ballots in the United States because you have to be entered in as an independent by March. This is the same problem that Bernie Sanders will have, folks, in the future if he decided. Now everyone says, oh, well, Bernie will run independent, we'll vote for him. Good luck when he can't go on a ballot in the state because he filed as a Democrat in March. This is how the system works. So you can't just lose the presidential candidacy or the bid and then just run independent and think you're going to have an equal shot.
Yeah, they actually set up laws this way and rules this way for sore losers. You can't be sour.
Damn
you can't
right.
be a sour grapes candidate and go, well, I didn't get it, so I'm going to go ahead and try to do it this way. They put stuff in play for that. But look, Bloomberg, he already scouted it. Michael Bloomberg, billionaire, right, mad money. He went and looked around and paid some people to say, hey, how would it look if he ran? And there's a room for a guy like that. I mean, there really is. But the numbers were so bleak. Right? The numbers were so bleak. He said, no. He said, even if it was an urgent thing and maybe I should, no thanks, not going to happen. And he doesn't have the same thing on the line that, let's say, a politician, right? A lot of this Never Trump movement and the people who are trying to do this, they're trying to find a politician with some kind of name recognition or anybody. They've even reached out to Mark Cuban to talk about this. But they're looking for people who honestly, they've got reputations on the line. And it's required. So you not only are they trying to woo somebody to be a kamikaze candidate, but they're trying to do it with the kind of caveat of, by the way, your career is going to be totally hosed. You people are not going to. You're going to have a hard time running, especially if you spoil it. If they view you as the spoiler, you're toast.
Yes. I think what really matters is the 2016 presidential candidacy is very, very important. It is. The voting that's going to be taking place in 2018 is going to be the bigger ones because that's when people are going for their seats. This is my own speculation here, but if you lay it out and you look at it and you say, will the Bernie Sanders movement push 2 years into the future and continue the policies and get more people elected in 2018? Or will this Donald Trump movement, is that going to last for 2 years and be the bomb that permanently changes the party? That's kind of the question that we'll have to see. My real opinion is there's going to be a lot of people that side with Trump that don't end up politically very well either, a la guys like Chris Christie. I don't think he's going to win in New Jersey again. I don't think it's because of Trump, but I think he was on the way out anyway, but it didn't save him to side with Trump either.
It's a double-edged sword these individuals are trying to dance on. It's a tough one.
Yeah, sure.
And Sarah Palin, she's jumped in on this too.
I know.
The fact that she's even relevant right now is just hilarious. I mean, I've really loathed her since the first time I ever saw her. I mean, it's true. You can go back. I think all the videos are still online.
And that actually brings up the other article that we're going to get into, which is from The Hill. This is about Paul Ryan and Donald Trump. The GOP civil war reaches a fever pitch. This is by Eric Ham, who's a contributor. He says, Speaker Paul Ryan's reluctance to endorse presumptive nominee Donald Trump has escalated an already bruising and self-defeating internal battle with the GOP. After a scorched earth primary that saw the reality TV star berate, demean, and insult his way in front of a deeply fractured field, Trump has turned his ire on the Speaker of the House. Then we get into Sarah Palin.
Yeah, Sarah Palin says that she's going to canter Paul Ryan. She's going to canter him, meaning, of course, she's hailing back to former House Majority Leader Eric Cantor, Republican from Virginia, and his primary loss to a Tea Party conservative in 2014. And she's not the only one. There's others.
She's not.
A whole bunch of his colleagues are ticked off.
I think the number is just as high, the amount of people in the GOP telling Paul Ryan to concede, as it is the amount of people that are in the DNC telling Bernie Sanders supporters to gut it out and go with Hillary. I think the numbers are...
They're losing numbers, but they're big.
Yeah, they're big. This goes back to the article. In addition to Palin, some of Ryan's colleagues have derided the Wisconsin lawmaker for his comments, suggesting that Ryan, not Trump, is hindering the party unification process.
What do you think of that, Joe?
I think that's crazy.
The Speaker of the House.
Yeah, well, I think it's crazy. I think the person that has walked in there saying, I'm going to burn this mother to the ground, and now that I'm the guy standing in the rubble, you need to join me. I think that's definitely the guy that has caused problems in the party, not the person who's reluctant at the end to join up with him.
Other people, man, they got George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, the Never Trump movement, Jeb Bush, right? And listen, a lot of the Never Trump movement are people who are really wrapped up with the Bush conservatism and people who went to bat for this and who still to this day talk about how really there were a bunch of weapons of mass destruction, that whole crowd. And so I think that it starts to look like a referendum. It starts to look like the people that are being rejected by the party, the philosophy and the underlying ideas of this school of conservative thought, that it's a referendum on this, and that those individuals, the thought leaders of that, are the ones that are trying to rally others to say, listen, this is a big deal. I mean, this is casting away years and years of Republican thought and ideas. And the difficulty is that people like Paul Ryan have to look around him and say, our party, if I like it or not, our party is saying, yeah, it is kind of a judgment on that.
Yeah. The problem is what I'm seeing the Tea Party movement was Windows 98, and we're seeing the Windows XP version of a disorganized movement coming to destroy more of an organized system. But the only plan is to disembowel it. Like, look, what did the Tea Party do when they got all those seats? They became the most stagnant Congress ever. What is this movement coming in going to be? Where is the production going to come from? Where's the base of people that are going to flow in and that say, we have policies we want to put in place. We have bills we want to introduce. The question is...
Trump's taking a position on... I can throw two out.
Sure.
Raising the minimum wage. He's on board now with the raising of the minimum wage. And also transgender bathrooms.
Yeah.
And I'd say, and the fact that part of his brand, whether people believe it or not, part of his brand is something that's literally antithetical to the brand of Ted Cruz being a Tea Party warrior coming in on that wave. And his mantra was no negotiation. Mm-hmm. Like, we don't deal with these people. You don't negotiate with terrorists. You don't negotiate with liberal Democrats. And it was kind of that idea. Whereas Trump, central to his whole thing is that he's a master of deal making, that he'll make deals even with people like Pelosi, that he'd be willing to talk to them, sit down with them, and make deals with them. So that is, I would say that is where you have a split. And that's where a lot of the older crowd, the Tea Party crowd, part of the Never Trump movement, that they look at that and they say, well, look, he's doing the opposite of what we said. He's saying he would make deals with these people. And so I can't promise that would happen. I can't promise that he would act differently than the Tea Partiers that came in before who gridlock Central, right, and filibuster Central, those guys. I can't promise that won't happen. But at the same time, I have to take at least some of what he's saying and say it seems like this is the case, because it would otherwise be really unpopular. And it is unpopular amongst the Tea Party crowd.
Winning an election and being a good leader are two very, very different things. Saying what you need to say to win an election, he started off his campaign by saying you can't move the minimum wage, there's too many jobs we'd lose. Now he's going into the national election saying we can change it. If you're the Republican that's supporting him, what bills do you introduce? Do you introduce a bill today to change the minimum wage to go higher? Because 2 months from now, Donald Trump may tell you that he wants it to be lower again. And then you're the a-hole that introduced the higher bill. And you're on the outs with the President of the United States, who's notorious for burning bridges. And see you, son.
Then he would be working only with Democrats. And that would be a good thing. He'd be working with Dems if the Republicans say they don't want to work with him.
But do you really think that people voting for Donald Trump are voting for him because he said, I'm willing to work with Democrats? That's what they heard? Because what they've heard is make America first and put America first again, make America great again. We're a bunch of pussies and we need to toughen up. And where in all that does I'm going to make negotiations with Democrats come in?
That it's repeated over and over. And as I said, I'm not going to promise anything on his behalf for a campaign. I mean, I don't know how he would behave.
Does it count as a promise to say we're going to make deals, so many deals, they're going to be the greatest deals, you've never seen better deals than this? Does that actually count? Is that a legitimate statement towards saying you're going to actually do something?
I think that's what every single one of them are saying. I think that every single politician up there, to one degree or another, is saying that. Now, maybe he's saying it like a fourth grader would, which may be why so many people relate to what he's saying, right? When you're going into journalism school, they say write at a fifth grade level. He speaks at a fourth grade level and's got apparently some mass appeal. But I think that not only are people kind of saying that they'll make the best deals and they'll be the best person for it, but they're also saying that they want to make America great again, that they lament certain things that are happening, and they believe that some things need to be restored and some things just require progression. And that if they do those things combined and make deals with the other side, then maybe they'll get somewhere.
True. I think you're right. I think all of these politicians have been talking a lot of BS, and it stinks to high heaven. The only thing is I think Donald Trump is dumping so much BS in there that it stinks so bad we don't smell it anymore. But it's a worry of my own. It's my own postulation. Take it as you will.
All righty, folks. We'll be right back right after these messages.
Now back to Joe and Jeremiah.
We want to give a shout out to our super duper Patreon follower and donator, Damian Davis, who is donating a spectacular $5 an episode. You are a fantastic gentleman.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Totally awesome. A stupendous paleocrat, bona fide.
What does Damian get for that, or what can you get by joining Patreon and joining our movement here at Paleo Radio? You can get a Google Hangout session. When you add over a $1 donation to Patreon, what we do is we're going to take your email address, add it to a closed loop that's going to get you involved with a Google Hangout or Skype event that Jeremiah and I are going to be hosting, which is basically a sit and chill session where you can ask us any questions about the show, or we can ask you questions about your life, basically getting to know our fans.
We'll pick each other's brains, and it's going to be tons of fun.
Yes, and it is great, but only if you become a member of Patreon and donate over $1 to the show.
And you can do that by going to patreon.com/PaleoRadio. Moving right along, our third segment here. UN director admits Syrians not fleeing over war. Gulf countries, quote, haven't taken a single one. This is by Raheem Kassam over at Breitbart. And there's actually a couple points right out of the gate that we ought to say. The first one I'll mention, I'll throw it out there. I'm amazed that Breitbart has somebody writing for them named Raheem Kassam.
I am blown away as well.
When I read this, I was like, this is fantastic. This is really a good one.
The other thing to add to this, too, is right in the title, there is something that you and I have been talking about all the time, which is that the Gulf states, the Gulf nations, are not taking in Syrian refugees, which is a serious, serious issue.
Yeah, it's something that those governments have been denying, right? Pretty devoutly, pretty ferociously. They've been saying that's not true, and lo and behold, well, it looks like it's true. The Director General of the United Nations office in Geneva has revealed most of the migrants from Syria are not fleeing persecution or war, and has lashed out at both the United States and the Arab Gulf countries, who he claims are not doing enough to accommodate more migrants. And we were wondering earlier where this guy, his role or whatever. But, Director General of the United Nations office in Geneva.
Yes.
So that people need to be specific, because it says UN Director admits in the title, and then later says this is a guy specific to the office in Geneva, right? So I don't know, in the overall scheme, not exactly sure where it lands them. But to say they're not fleeing from persecution or war, now, you almost got to wonder, because there's been reports that people are, in fact, leaving for that. In fact, we watched a documentary not long ago. There's one on Vice. You mentioned one in the lead up to the show, to a video where you can actually see a flyover.
Yeah, that's on BBC.
On BBC.
And you can look at the city of Aleppo, and well, that's the whole thing is this would probably be believable if there was a giant exodus of Syrians before this war broke out. There's this odd correlation between the whole entire country going into a war state and then having a bunch of people that are fleeing the country.
But I don't deny that a lot of what he's saying is probably true as well. You know, he's talking about how it's not just simply because of persecution or war, but there's a lot of other incentives that he's discovered in his experience that a lot of this has to do with education. He had an interview, right, with the Huffington Post this week. His name is Michael Mueller, and he described his dissatisfaction with the response to Europe's migrant crisis, specifically taking aim at the media for failing to educate the public and calling for schools to, quote, educate the youth for the problems of tomorrow. And so his criticism is pretty broad. I mean, he's criticizing the United States, he's criticizing Brazil, he's criticizing Canada, he's criticizing Mexico, he's criticizing Asian countries, he's criticizing European countries, he's criticizing Saudi Arabia and certain Arab countries. So you sit there and you say, this guy, he's upset with a lot of what's going on, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of people,
Yes.
and in his country, to their credit, I mean, they're at a point where the populace there is at a breaking point, where they're upset about it, where it's causing huge amounts of strife.
Yes.
Over how many that they're taking in and the way that it's kind of like Germany, where
Yes.
Germany's having this thing where Angela Merkel, I mean, her approval ratings tanked. I mean, her approval rating's almost like the United States Congress. It's really terrible. So, you know, it's a tough situation, but he's mad at the world. And when he says they're not doing enough, what he means is they haven't taken a single one.
I think that is the biggest point to make about all this, and that's the one that I hold in the most value of what he said, is saying, look, there's a lot of Gulf nations that aren't even playing ball with this, and they're just basically letting this great exodus out of Syria with all these people going around. But I guess if you look at it and you play the end game, I guess what I'm trying to say is it depends on our perspective here. If our perspective is, does it do each individual country good to take on a load of people that are refugees from a war-torn country that you don't know their skills and you don't have them very vetted? No. Does it do good as a world to take the predominant youth of a nation that's been in a third world status and has a ridiculous idea of religion placed upon them, to remove them from that area and have them grow up in a Western society where they can possibly go back to that area with different viewpoints? Yes.
One's a long term and one's a short term.
Just like how we look at it and we say, are we going to bomb it into safety? I don't think so. You can re-educate into safety. And I know there's a lot of people that will say, well, Joe, here you are saying you need to re-educate people in the Middle East about different cultures. And I'll say, well, Western civilization is secular, and it's managed to corral Christianity to a way where we don't hang people anymore for being heretics or burn them at the stake. And I suggest that secular law can do the same thing in the Middle East.
Where you don't have gay people being shoved off of tall buildings.
Absolutely.
Where you don't have people being crucified in the street or stoned, being buried up to their neck, and then being with rocks hurled at their face until they're dead. I mean, that's kind of, you could be some leaven to that batch with some Western education.
And hey, I'm also going to just tail this in there so people can understand my viewpoint. I'm also somebody who says that we can absolutely positively digress back into being a fundamental religious state here in the United States, where people will use that fervor and angst and become ridiculous and become outlandish. And any country is susceptible to falling into religious fundamentalism.
I go back to this and I say, it sucks. It sucks because you have the two different ways that you mentioned. One of those, you'd have a lot of people who would say, I know that it's not maybe as good in the long run as the second, but I'm really scared now.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of things changing, and you can't promise me that things are going to remain stable enough that I can recognize it on the other side. So there's a natural impulse, I think, for a lot of people, a lot of our species, okay, to say, you know what, there is a value to order, to a sustained stability, to continuity. These are things that are okay. They're not bad at all. Not necessarily or inherently. And so that's good. And yet, on the other hand, bringing in people to educate them is way better than having this kind of floating mob of people, this large throng of individuals floating around with no place to call their own. I mean, that's dangerous.
That group of people will most likely return to an area that could possibly be more fervently religious, and then all you need is a couple generations of people growing into that, and you have another Saudi Arabian state established in Syria. The chances of people in Western society and in the Gulf nations not taking in Syrian refugees and them going back to Syria with nothing to do, having known that they attempted to leave and were told that nobody wants them, the chances of them going and building a great society that's going to play ball and join the United Nations in 10 years is crazy. The chance of them going and developing into a fervent, fundamentalist religious state is pretty high, especially if you have a bunch of those numbers of people that went to leave Assad get thrown back into the mix inside the city again. The ones that didn't want to fight in the first place. They're going to do nothing. They have nothing to do but fight.
And listen, I'm public. I've said it before on the show that, I'm not a big fan. I'm a restrictionist on this. I am very skeptical about vetting and stuff. I'm very skeptical even of the arguments John Oliver made. And I've got questions I'd love to ask the guy about it. And I'd encourage people to go and watch what he had to say. But at the same time, what Joe just said, this isn't the first time Joe has said that either. And he and I have private conversations. And what he just said, and I hope people really take the time, it's a podcast, you can do this, and you're not going to get in trouble. Go back and just listen again. Give yourself a minute and a half. Go back and listen again, and really think about it, because I understand people when they say that they feel as if they are strong-armed into a position outside of their control that's now put them in a place where what they've understood as identity and understood as their culture, that these questions have been thrust upon them due to circumstances outside of their control, outside of their country, maybe not entirely outside their control, right? We have a foreign policy debacle that we have. But at the same time, the individual Johnny Q. Sally Sue type, that they feel that this is something that they don't want any part of. The problem is, no matter what your decision is, you are a part of it now. You've been a part of it for a long time. And you really have to think this through, what Joe said. If we send them back, and if we don't open up our arms, I'm not saying to become open borders.
No.
I'm not saying any of that, right? People know me. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I'm looking at this and I'm saying this is a real situation that in many ways was thrust upon them too. And we have to be able to look at it and say, in the long run, what is going to be better for our children and for our children's children, and even for ourselves? I mean, I'm not even going to pretend that we wouldn't have demonstrably good effects of having some kind of Western inclusion of these individuals within the first 2 years.
Sure.
I think you would be able to have data points that indicate that this is a good thing, that this is proving good already. But within a matter of 30 years, I don't think there will be any doubt. I think the only doubt would be that it would be just left to a hypothetical as to how rotten the world would be if we didn't.
And right now we're actually facing the hypothetical of what it will be on either end, because we really don't know. We're seeing kind of the arguments going on. And we're going to find out. We're going to see, because the Syrian refugee crisis isn't over, and it's still playing out. And we're going to see what will happen to those people. The one thing I would say is, and I know this is just an outlandish, crazy thing to suggest, but imagine here in the western part of the United States, there's a huge uprising. The Oregon militia, the wildlife militia guys, they actually won it, right? And they're actually fighting the government. And all those states on the western side become a war zone. They're starting to get blown to crap between the Oregon militia and the United States government. And the people living in Oregon go to leave to Canada. And Canada seals its border and says, we need to have a vetting process. We can't just let people willy-nilly come running into Canada from the United States, although we know that most people coming are good. The problem is, when you're caught in that middle, you're either going to have to make a choice. Are you going to be with the government, or are you going to be with the militia? Because being indifferent is not an option in a war zone.
It's not. I'll tell you, I wish we had tons of time, because Mueller talked about stuff to do with the media that we could have just talked about forever.
Yeah, he did.
Everybody, you got to go check it out. UN director admits Syrians not fleeing over war. It's by Raheem Kassam over at Breitbart. We'll be right back.
For debates, interviews, or speeches, contact PaleoRadio Show at gmail.com.
You love to hate 'em, you hate to love 'em. You just can't get enough of 'em, you sick freaks. PaleoRadio's on the air.
We have some super amazing followers, Joe. The names just literally are screaming out at me.
Yeah, and it's quite a different set of groups. It's fantastic.
It is. We have a whole bunch of different people, because all in like a burst.
Yeah.
In a matter of maybe a couple hours. But listen, this one is loud and proud. Patriot Surge.
Yes.
Evil is powerless if the good are unafraid. And there's a slew of hashtags. I don't want to go through all of them.
Hashtag city.
Lots of. He's a very engaged person. We also have Tetro. And you can find Tetro at Tetro Magic. That's Tetro. He's a magician and designer. Loves technology, science, and connecting people. And he connected with us on Twitter, so we're going to give him a huge honking shout-out. Abracadabra.
Thank you guys very much for supporting the show. We definitely love you, and we love the support. This is a new article out of Gizmodo, very interesting one. Former Facebook workers, we routinely suppressed conservative news. This is by Michael Nunez. Facebook workers routinely suppressed news stories of interest to conservative readers from the social network's influential trending news section, according to a former journalist who worked on the project. The individual says that workers prevented stories about right-wing CPAC gatherings, Mitt Romney, Rand Paul, and other conservative topics from appearing in the highly influential section, even though they were organically trending among other sites' users.
I'll tell you, I know this is a complete lie. The guy's lying through his teeth.
Yes.
Yeah, Mitt Romney
How could he?
never, ever organically
There's
trended,
no way.
ever.
Actually, you know what? I bet you there's one time, and it's when he locked his dog up on his roof and went for a long drive. If you recall that was one of the things. Or his elevator portion in his house. Those are two real big Mitt Romney joke stories that people enjoyed.
Didn't it trend when he did the whole, 46%?
Oh, yeah, that's
I mean,
right.
I guess
yeah.
it was the other memorable times everybody just missed out.
Yeah, he's
on,
got a
eh?
couple.
Yeah,
he's got a couple gems.
Yeah, he's got the, corporations are people too, my friend. He's got that whole thing.
Oh yeah, that one's just delightful.
It's a
isn't
gem.
It? Yeah, corporations are people too, my friend. Who do you think the money goes to? People. Huh?
Yeah, ta-da.
Ah, you're very clever, Mitt. These new allegations emerge after Gizmodo last week revealed details about the inner workings of Facebook's trending news team, a small group of young journalists, primarily educated at Ivy League and private East Coast universities, who curate the trending module in the upper right-hand corner of the site. As we reported last week, this is Gizmodo again, curators have access to a ranked list of topics that surface from Facebook's algorithm, which prioritizes the stories that should be shown on Facebook's users through the trending section. The curators write headlines and summaries of each topic and include links to new sites. The section, which launched in 2014, constitutes some of the most powerful real estate on the Internet and helps dictate what news Facebook users, 167 million in the U.S. alone, are reading at any given moment.
Right. It's huge real estate.
Lots.
I mean, massive. You have, what was it? It's the number one American pastime now?
Yeah.
It's almost 60 minutes, I think. Almost 60 minutes of their waking day would be spent doing this. And so, of all the different things outside of work, it seems to be the most popular thing, because a lot of people even do it at work.
I mean, that number's massive.
It's huge. It's massive. And so you've got a massive number of people spending a huge amount of time on this. And for most people, that's where they get their news. Now, personally, I don't get any of my news from Facebook. I don't go ever.
I don't use Facebook as my area of getting all my fantastic news.
Now, Twitter.
Twitter shows up fast. They say that Facebook will never catch up to Twitter in real-time news stories, and it never will. It's just basically the way it's built, I think.
But these new curators, man, they are essentially, the way they're functioning would be like the news team, right? Your traditional newsroom that you have, where someone sits down and they say, well, here's a bunch of stories that have bubbled up overnight, and we have to make choices because there's a limited amount of space.
That's true.
The whole concept. You have a cutoff line.
Yes.
Right? I mean, you have that, and so you have to make decisions, and then you have to have somebody who makes a blurb, who writes something about it that gives a basic idea for what's in the story.
I think what really matters, though, is how often conservative news stories that had the same thing, or liberal news stories, or maybe even what would be considered the middle, how often the right-wing ones were cut from that if it was the same story is kind of the question in the topic, I think. In the story, it has, or going on in the article, Stories covered by conservative outlets like Breitbart, Washington Examiner, and Newsmax that were trending enough to be picked up by Facebook's algorithm were excluded unless mainstream sites like New York Times, the BBC, or CNN covered the same stories. So, which would make sense. I mean, obviously, you would say if you hear one of these major news sites come up with a story, you want to wait till there's a couple other.
Well, because people might not realize that just because a lot of people are liking something from WorldNet Daily, that it's necessarily the same thing as if you get a number of people liking something from the New York Times. Not saying the New York Times is perfect, but there's no doubt which one is preferable against WorldNet Daily.
Yeah, that's right.
For objectivity, for reliability of sources and stuff like that. And listen, we have tons of criticism of the Times. We've criticized the Times even on the show. So, but the idea that it's comparable. So I understand in a way the editorial decision that has to be made, and yet and the idea that, well, it gives it credibility because now it's an official source that goes ahead and publishes these. But sometimes you get stories, and this is the risky business. Sometimes you get stories in the National Enquirer.
You do.
Yeah.
And where do you go with them?
Most people wait, and they say, we're going to wait until a mainstream source writes about this exact same thing. True enough. And I think that that's a prudent safeguard, actually.
It is. I think with Facebook, this paragraph here that's in the article is really telling. It says, other former curators interviewed by Gizmodo denied consciously suppressing conservative news, but were unable to determine if left-wing news topics or sources were similarly suppressed. The conservative curator described the omissions as a function of his colleagues' judgments. There's no evidence that Facebook management mandated or even was aware of any political bias at work. Which you would understand. Facebook obviously isn't sitting there twiddling their fingers going, yes, and then the next one we're going to put out is going to be the most left-wing paper we can possibly do. But you can say people from certain universities will have a certain idea of what news topics or what news organizations are actually trustworthy, and that can differ in reality. For instance,
from its users.
Pew Research polls, and I encourage people to look this up, will show that, and I know there's been a lot of changes, but for the last about decade, MSNBC by far has the most opinion on their news station than any other news network, by far, farther than Fox, farther than CNN. And most people wouldn't believe that, but it's absolutely true. And it just depends on how people look at these processes. They think of, a lot of people in the left wing think of MSNBC as something that actually is a pillar of justice and news, and a lot of it's hard news source, and most of it's straight opinion time.
Which is maybe why it's gotten so popular recently.
Absolutely.
Interestingly enough, it beat out a whole bunch of other hours, and Morning Joe got to give the old credit to that guy and that show that just recently went in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, they saw a model that worked and they replicated it. I can say that. But I think in Facebook, this is the big kicker. Bringing it back to Facebook is how many times these people that have been interviewed would say that how the people that have been interviewed would say they can't tell if they did the same thing with left-wing news, but they know they did it with right-wing news. Is that kind of shows a bias already?
Well, and maybe some of the left-wing people might say that the right-wing people were doing that. I don't know.
Yeah,
right-wing people came out and talked, right? They talked to Gizmodo. I don't know, but it seems like a kind of an iffy thing. But part of it is because of the degrees of separation. The people, you could normally ask the question. You could say, well, what are Facebook's hiring standards for people who do this particular job? Well, come to find out, they don't hire the people to do those jobs. They hire another organization that, in fact, hires another organization that hires the people who will eventually work for Facebook.
Yes.
So you got to maybe go there. But if anybody's interested in something to do with newsroom type work, then they may have gone to school for it. And so you can look at that and say, across the board, I mean, there's no question that the vocation of journalism is by and large center-left. There's no doubt about it.
Oh, sure, without a doubt.
There's no doubt. It's the kind of person who takes freedom of speech very seriously and getting in everybody's business, and also enjoying the diversity of life that says, hey, there's all different sorts of things. There's differences, and this is amazing to report on and describe in real time. So you're going to have people that's kind of their disposition. You don't have that as much with people having moral foundations that land them more on the right.
That's true.
You just don't.
That's true. I think in Facebook's case, too, when you were talking about having a newsroom, That's one of their little shticks, though, is they say that they don't operate like a newsroom. They don't have this type of editing. They don't have this type of play out. And that's just simply not true. That's really what the focus is of this article, I think, is because they've been telling everybody basically this is organic and it happens, and the top 10 things that come up are the things that you see.
Like there's a computer in a room.
And it just prints out, beat, delete, and then there it is. There's all the trending topics. And somebody just writes them out. But this is another quote by one of the curators. We were always cautious about covering Facebook. We would always wait to get a second level of approval before trending something to Facebook. Usually we had to get an authority to trend anything in or out of our own, but it was something involving Facebook. The copy editor would call their manager, and that manager might even call their manager before approving the topic involving it.
What do you think about that?
I think that says that they're definitely like a regular newsroom.
Right.
The same way that if the biggest story was that the editor of the New York Post had a mistress, I don't know if the New York Post is going to be writing about that a whole lot. Because there's definitely kind of a top-down order that says we don't write about in-house things necessarily.
Yeah, what's the phrase Fox News uses, Roger Ailes, isn't it, don't shoot inside the tent? I think that's what it is, don't shoot inside the tent.
Sure, and that's why it shows that Facebook really isn't playing that much different of a game. They're just kind of saying that they are. And I think we've known this all along. I mean, just like you said, there's an obvious bias, but you can say, too, that Fox News doesn't necessarily come out with the most factual representations all the time either, so having to get a second opinion doesn't necessarily hurt.
Well, and they talked about injection, right? That stories could be injected, and there was talk of two different things in this story, and I encourage everybody to read it. But they talked about the Syrian refugees, that there was a time where people just simply, and even now, they're just simply not talking about it very much. It seems like now it's moved on into different areas of social justice. But Syrian refugees is still happening, and so there would be times where the accusation was that that was injected in for some cred. Same thing, the accusation with the hashtag Black Lives Matter.
Yes, and saying that they influenced or kept it into the algorithm longer than it actually was.
Now, there was a meeting with Facebook. You had Mark Zuckerberg. He met with a whole bunch of conservative leaders, and they all walked out of there pretty much encouraged by this, optimistic, and saying, we don't believe that Facebook was in bad faith. But that's the newest, up-to-date thing. But they still want to overcome this process and say, how can we ensure that it's not going to happen anymore?
That story is going to continue on, but our story this week is not. That is music for our final segment.
I know, I was totally crying leading up to this moment.
Man, it happens so fast like it always does.
Every time.
Thank you guys for listening, and thank you guys for supporting us on patreon.com/PaleoRadio. We really, really appreciate it. It's how we eat.
We're going to be here for the next 2 shows, Joe, the next 2 weekends. But after that, we're totally at Reason Rally.
That's right. We're going to be at Reason Rally. We'll be in D.C. It's going to be fantastic. Hopefully, we will see some of you there.
And we're going to have a crazy schedule the remainder of the summer, but you can find out and follow all that information by going to paleoradio.secularmediagroup.com.
We will see you next week.
You've been listening to Paleo Radio, exclusively with Secular Media Group.